Hello, everyone. How are we? I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. Today is just gonna be a full, relaxing ASMR stream. Hello. Just reading a book. That's all it is. I'm actually gonna make my book a little... That's not what I wanted. Unlock items, thank you. Make this book a little bigger. There we go. Okay. So, I wanted to try out, since we're trying out different forms of ASMR streams, first time was eating ramen, eating spicy noodles. I thought something else that we can try would be reading a book, because that way you can also get like the nice like sound of the book. I chose Lord of the Rings because it's actually something that I've never read. I'm in love with Lord of the Rings. I'm in love with The Hobbit. I've seen the movies multiple times, but I've never actually read the book. And while I was unpacking some boxes, it turns out that I actually have my good old trusty Fellowship of the Ring book. It's so like beaten and broken. Every corner is bent. There's cracks in the binding. It's worn. It might be honestly older than me, I'm not gonna lie. But I thought it would be a great time so that way we can sit down together. We can all, you know, listen while I read you a wonderful little story. Hello, Dans. I am having fun. I hope you are too. I like your ASMR girlfriend videos. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm really glad. I hope that you guys like it, and I hope you like the new video. It is a bit different than the other ones. It's not only like a full collab video, but it's also with like a little bit of different editing as well. So I hope you guys like it. I'm gonna go ahead. I have a question for you guys. Would we want to keep like the classic music that I have running right now, or do we want to switch to a little more comfy and have some fireplace like crackling in the background? How does that sound? Because I really like it whenever I love to read. It's raining or there's like a fire in the back. I really like it because it just really gets in like that comfy mood, you know? Is that something we would like? We can try it out, see how it sounds. Should be playing right now. How does that sound? I hope it's like a good quality one. There shouldn't be any ads on it. I made sure this one's like a no ad one. And if I'm wrong, then I'm sorry. I do sincerely apologize. Yeah? Okay, wonderful. Alright, so we are reading Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, the first part. Okay. The pages are like a little yellowed from how, you know, old they are. And it has like the classic like old book smell. You like take a big deep breath and it just kind of gently graces your nose, you know? What am I doing, a face reveal? See, I'm never taking off this mask. It's not happening. And I'd only do it for a good lump sum of money. You gotta bribe me. I'm good when it comes to being bargained with. But otherwise, no. Mask isn't really coming off. It's a part of the bit. I gotta keep it on. You know, we can't be a skull cult if I don't wear a skull. It just, I think it just makes sense like that. Oh, let me go ahead, drink some water too. Mm-hmm. That's correct. You gotta bribe me. And listen, my prices aren't low at all. I'm not a cheap girl. Listen, I'm pretty expensive on the market. So you can bribe me as you want, but unless it hits, you know, my threshold, it's not happening. Okay. Let's start. We got quite a bit to read through. I highly doubt we'll get through it all, but let's see if we can at least get through a good portion of it. That would be good. Okay. First few pages are just like the maps. Heck no, that's okay. You don't have to. I'm not saying that it's mandatory, you know? It's only for the special few who are feeling brave and generous, that's all. Okay. Prologue 1. Title is Concerning Hobbits. Let's begin, shall we? This book is largely concerned with hobbits. From its pages, a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the section from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. It's yeah. I just gotta give that disclaimer ahead of time. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him there and back again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return, an adventure which later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, where they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellow, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days, they were, as a rule, shy of the, quote, big folk, as they call us. And now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are none the less nimble and deft in their movements. They possess from the first art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk whom they do not wish to meet become blundered by, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and a close friendship with the earth have rendered. This is a big word. I'm not gonna lie, if there are big words in here, it's gonna be rough. That rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. For they are little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging from 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say, and in ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Bandobras took, or Bulror, son of Isgrim II, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records by only 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As for the hobbits of the Shire with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of green and yellow, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus, the only craft little practiced among them was shoemaking, but they had long and skillful fingers and could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were as rule good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat and drink often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at times, and of 6 meals a day when they could get them. They were hospitable. Thank you, Omega, for the follow. Thank you for joining us. They were hospitable and delighted in parties and in presents when they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves, or even than dwarves. Of old they spoke of languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much the same as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only elves are still preserve many records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. And the world being after all full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed very little important. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and great. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed, but the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those which they still linger. The northwest of the old world, east of the sea. Their original home of the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them. But there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books and even gathered reports of old times and distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear, nonetheless, from these legends, and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that, like many other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to be a glimpse of time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains, where they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eredor, no longer certain. Their own accounts speaking of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into 3 somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stores, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stores were broader, heavier in build, and their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin, and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early and roamed over Eridor as far as the Weathertop, while the others were still in the wilder land. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, as far as most numerous. Sorry, let me adjust my. There we go. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and the longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in the tunnels and holes. The Stores lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots, and followed the course of the loud water southwards, and there were many of them long dwelt between Tharbard and the borders of Dunlin before they moved north again. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northly branch. They were more friendly with the elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell and came down to the river Harwell. In Eridor, they soon mingled with other kinds and had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harfoots' Stores. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallowhidish strain could be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Master of Buckland. In the westlands of Eridor, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, the remnants still dwelt there of the Dúnedain, the kings of men that came over the sea of the Western East. But they were dwindling fast, and the lands of the North Kingdom were falling far and wide to waste. There was room to spare for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of their earlier settlements had long disappeared and been forgotten in Bilbo's time. But one of the first to become important still endured. Though reduced in size, this was at Bree, and in the Chetwood that lay round about, some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in the early days, doubtless, that the hobbits earned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dúnedain, who had in their turn long before learned the art from elves. And in those days they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech, the West Run as it was named. That was the current through the land of the kings from Arnor to Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea from Belfalas to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and the great store of personal names out of the past. About this time, legend among the hobbits first became history with reckoning of years, for it was in the 1601st year of the Third Age that the Fallowhide brothers, Marco and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the Brown River Barad-dûn with great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of Stonebros that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell, between the river and the far downs. All that demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began the Shire reckoning. For the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became year 1 of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there, and is soon passed once more out of the history of men and elves. While there was a king, there were in the name of his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all in the events of the world outside. To the last battle at Fornost with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent home bowmen to aid the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men record it. But in that war the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and so they chose from their chiefs a thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There, for 1,000 years, they were little troubled by wars, and prospered and multiplied after the dark plague, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousand then perished, but the days of dearth were at the time of the long tale past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had been long deserted when they entered it, it had been well tilled, and the king had once had many farmers, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 for the northern moors to marshes and south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thrain, and the district of well-ordered business, and there in that pleasant corner of the world they piled their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less of the world outside, where dark things had moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they ever had known of the guardians, and of the labors and those that made the long peace of the Shire. They were in fact sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had the hobbits of any kind been warlike. They had never fought amongst themselves. In the old days they had, of course, been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in hard world, but in Bilbo's time that had been very ancient history. The last battle before this story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory, the Battle of Greenfields, in which Bandobras took, rooted an invasion of orcs. Even in the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So though there was some store of weapons in the Shire, these were mostly used as trophies, hanging above the hearths or on walls, or gathered into the museum of Mickle Delving. The Mathorn House, it was called, for anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away, they called a matham. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with mathans, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of that sort. Nevertheless, ease and peace had left these people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill, and they were perhaps so unwearily fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handlings by grief, foe, or weather, in a way that astonished those who did not know them well, and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel for the sport of killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay, and at need could still handle arms. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed, and sure at the mark, not only with bows and arrows. If any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all the trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home, but in the course of the time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire, in Bilbo's days, it was, as a rule, only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows, most of the primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple diggings of old, but suitable sites for these large and ramifying tunnels, or smells as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and low-lying districts of the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions in the older villages, such as Hobbiton or Tuckborough, or in the chief town of the Shire, Michael Delving on the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, and stone. These were specifically favored by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, and other of that sort, for even when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to building sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the marsh down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather, but they were well known to be stores in large part of their blood, as indeed it was shown by the down that many grew on their chins. No Harfoot or Fallowhide had any trace of beard. Indeed, the folk of the marsh and of Buckland, east of river, which they afterwards occupied, came for most part later into the Shire up from south far away, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is possible that the craft of building, as many other crafts beside, were derived from the Dúnedain, but the hobbits may have learned it direct from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at that time as grey havens away to the west. In other places, within reach of the Shire, 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen on the Tower Hills and beyond western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone on a green mound. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see from the sea from atop that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and even fewer had even returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even in rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. As the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them and distrustful of those that had dealings with them. And the sea became a word of fear among them and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. Let me grab a sip of water. Okay. Continuing. The craft of buildings may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were indeed no more built imitations of smiles, hatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turfs and having walls somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves, or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of hobbit architecture. The houses in the holes of Shire hobbits were often large and inhabited by larger families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were as bachelors very exceptional, as they were also in many other ways, such as their friendship with the elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Took of Great Smalls or the Brandybucks of Brandy Hall, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral and many-titled mansion. All hobbits were, in any case, clannish and reckoned up their relationships with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealings with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom, and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time which these tales of. The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of Westmarch are a small book in themselves, but all hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things if they were accurate. They liked to have books filled with things that they already know, set out fair and square, with no contradictions. There is another astonishing thing about hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled through pipes of clay or wood the smoke of burning leaves of a herb which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety of probably of Nicotiana. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this particular custom or art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybuck, later Master of Buckland, and since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play a part in history that follows, his remarks in the introduction to his Herb Lore of the Shire may be quoted. This, he says, is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke is not known. All the legends and family histories take it for granted. For ages folk in the Shire smoked various herbs, some fouler, some sweeter, but all accounts agree that Tobold Homeblower of Longbottom in the South Farthing first grew the true pipeweed in his gardens in the days of Isengrim II, about the year 1070 of Shire reckoning. The best homegrown still comes from that district, especially the varieties known as Longbottom Leaf, Old Toby, and Southern Star. How Old Toby became the plant is not recorded, but for his dying day he would not tell. He knew much about herbs, but he was no traveler. It was often said that in his youth he often went to Bree, though certainly he never went further from the Shire than that. It was thus possible that he learned of this plant in Bree, where now at any rate it grows well on the south slopes of the hill. The Bree hobbits claim to have been the first actual smokers of pipeweed. They claim, of course, to have done everything before the people of the Shire, whom they refer to as colonists, but in this case their claim is, I think, likely to be true. And it certainly was from the Bree that the art of smoking and genuine weed spread in the recent centuries among dwarves and such other folk. Rangers, wizards, or wanderers, as it still passed to and fro through the ancient road meeting. The home and center of the art is thus to be found in the old Inn of Bree, the Prancing Pony, that has been kept by the family of Butterbur from time beyond record. All the same observations that I have made on my own many journeys south have convinced me that the weed itself is not native to our parts of the world, but it came northward, from the lower Anduin, whither it was, I suspect, originally brought over sea by men of western East. It grows abundantly in Gondor, and there is richer and larger than the south, but where it is never found, and flourishes only in warm, sheltered places like Longbottom. The men of Gondor call it sweet galenus, and esteemed it for only the fragrance of its flowers. From that land it must have been carried up to Greenway during the long centuries between the coming of Enendil and our own days. But even in Dúnedain of Gondor allowed us this credit. Hobbits first put it to pipes. Not even the wizards first thought of that before we did. Though one of the wizards that I knew took up the art long ago, became as skillful in it as in all other things he put his mind to. The Shire was divided into 4 quarters. The farthings already referred it to north, south, east, and west, and these again each into their own number of folklands, which still bore the names of some old leading families, although by the time the history of these names were no longer found only in their proper folklands. Nearly all the Tooks still lived in Tookland, and that was not true of many other families, such as the Bagginesses or the Boffins. Outside the farthings were the east and west marches, the Buckland and the west march added to the Shire. The Shire at this time had hardly any government. Families for the most part managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that the estates, farms, workshops, and small trades tended to maintain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they called it, away north of the Shire. But there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king, for they attributed the king of the old all their essential laws, and usually kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thane had passed to them from old bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot and captain of the Shire Muster, and the Hobbity in arms, but as the Muster and Moot they were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred. The Thaneship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignity. The Took family was still indeed accorded to special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured nonetheless of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and of adding to his name, if required, a number, such as Isengrim II, for instance. The only real official the Shire at this date was the mayor of Michael Devling, or of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the free fair of the White Downs at Lith, and it was at midsummer. As mayor, almost all of his duties was to preside at banquets given on the Shire holidays, which occurred at the frequent intervals. But the offices of postmaster and first sheriff were attached to the mayoralty, so that he managed both the messenger service and the watch. These were the only Shire services, and the messengers were the most numerous and much busier of the two. By no means all hobbits were lettered, but those who were wrote constantly to all their friends, an exception of their relations, who lived further off than an afternoon's walk. The sheriffs of the name that the hobbits gave to their bullies, or the nearest equivalent that they possessed. They had, of course, no uniforms, such thing being quite unknown, only feather on their caps, and they were, in practice, rather than haywards than policemen, more concerned with the strayings of the beast than of people. There were all in the Shire only 12 of them, 3 in each farthing for inside work. Rather than the larger body, varying at need, was employed to the beat of set bounds, and to see that outsiders of any kind, great or small, did not make themselves a nuisance. At the time when the story begins, the bounders, as they were called, had been greatly increased. There were many reports and complaints of strange persons and creatures prowling on the borders or over them, The first sign, all that was not quite it should be, was always been except in the tales and legends long ago. Few heeding the sign, not even Bilbo yet had any notion of what portended. 60 years had passed since he set out on his memorable journey, and he was even old for hobbits, who remained 100 as often as not, but much evidently still remained of the considerable wealth that he had brought back. How much or how little he revealed to no one, not even to Frodo, his favorite nephew, and he still kept secret the ring he had found. As in told the Hobbit, there came one day to Bilbo's door the great wizard, Gandalf the Grey, and 13 dwarves with him, none other indeed than Thorn Oakenshield, descendant of the kings, and his 12 companions in exile. With them he set out, to his own lasting astonishment. On a morning of April, it began in the year 1341, Shire reckoning, on a quest of great treasure. The dwarf hordes of the king under the mountain beneath Erebor and Dale, far off in the east. The quest was successful, and the dragon that guarded the horde was destroyed. Yet though before all was won, the battle of 5 armies was fought, and Thorin was slain, and many deeds of renown were done. The matter would scarcely have concerned later history, or earned the more note in the long annals of the Third Age, for an accident, by the way. The party was assailed by orcs on a high pass in the Misty Mountains, as they went towards the Wilderland, and so happened that Bilbo was lost for a while in the black orc mines deep under the mountains, and there, as he groped in vain dark, put his hand on the ring, lying on the floor of a tunnel. He put it in his pocket. It seemed then like mere luck. Trying to find his way out, Bilbo went down on the roots of the mountains until he could go no further. At the bottom of the tunnel lay a cold lake, far from the light, and on an island of rock in the water lived Gollum. He was a lonesome little creature. He paddled with a small boat with his large, flat feet, peering with pale, luminous eyes, and catching blind fish with his long fingers, and eating them raw. He ate any living thing, even orc, if he could catch it and strangle it without struggle. He possessed a secret treasure that had come to him in long ages ago, where he still lived in the light. A ring of gold that was made its wearer invisible. It was one thing that he loved, his precious, and he talked to it, even when it was not with him, for he kept it hidden safe in a hole on his island, except when he was hunting or spying on the orcs of the mines. Maybe he would have attacked Bilbo at once if the ring had been on him when they met, but it was not, and the hobbit held it in his hand an elvish knife, which served him as a sword. So to gain time, Gollum challenged Bilbo to the riddle game, saying that if he asked a riddle which Bilbo could not guess, he would kill him and eat him. But if Bilbo defeated him, then he would do as Bilbo wished. He would lead him to the way out of the tunnels. Since he was lost in the dark without hope, and could neither go on nor back, Bilbo accepted the challenge, as they asked one another many riddles. In the end, Bilbo won the game, more by luck as it seemed than by wits, for he was stumped at the last riddle to ask, and cried out, as his hand came upon the ring he had picked up and forgotten. "What have I got in my pocket?" This Gollum failed to answer, though he demanded 3 guesses. The authorities, true it is, differ from whether the last question was a mere question and not a riddle, according to the strict rules of the game. But all agreed that after accepting it and trying to guess the answer, Gollum was bound by his promise. And Bilbo pressed him to keep his word, but the thought came to him that this slimy creature might prove false, and even though such promises were held sacred, but of old and all the wicked things feared to break them. But after ages alone in the dark, Gollum's heart was black, and treachery was in it. He slipped away and returned to his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, not far off in the dark. Water. There, he thought, lay his ring. He was hungry now and angry, and once his precious was with him, he would not fear any weapon at all. But the ring was not on the island. He had lost it. It was gone. His screech sent a shiver down Bilbo's back, though he did not yet understand what happened. But Gollum had at last leaped to a guess too late. "What has it got in its pockets?" he cried. The light in his eyes was like a green flame that had sped back to murder the hobbit and recover his precious. Just in time, Bilbo saw his peril and fled blindly to the passage away from the water. And once more he was saved by his luck, for just he ran and put his hand in his pocket, the ring slipped quietly on his finger. And so it was that Gollum passed him without seeing him, and went to guard the way out, lest the thief should escape. Warily, Bilbo followed him as he went along, cursing and talking to himself about his precious, from which talk at last even Bilbo guessed the truth, and a hope came to him in the darkness. He himself had found the marvelous ring and chance of escape from the orcs and from Gollum. At length they came to a halt before an unseen opening that led to the lower gates of the mines on the eastward side of the mountains. There Gollum crouched at bay, smelling and listening, and Bilbo tempted to slay him with his sword. But pity stayed him, and though he kept the ring, which was his only hope lay, he would not use it to help him kill the wretched creature at a disadvantage. In the end, gathering his courage, he leapt over Gollum in the dark and fled away down the passage, pursued by his enemy cries of hate and despair. "Thief, thief, Bagginses, we hates it forever." Now it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions. To them, his account was that Gollum had promised him to gift him a present if he won the game, but when Gollum went to fetch it from the island where he found the treasure was gone, a magic ring which had been given to him long ago on his birthday. Bilbo guessed that this was the very ring that he had found, and he had won the game, which was already by his right, but being in a tight place, he said nothing about it, and made Gollum show him the way out as a reward instead of present. This allowed Bilbo to set down in his memoirs, and seems he never altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently, Stillen appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts, but many copies contain the true account, as an alternative, derived no doubt from the notes of Frodo or Samwise, both whom which learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete any actually written by the old hobbit himself. Gandalf, however, disbelieved Bilbo's story as soon as he heard it, and he continued to be very cautious about the ring. Eventually, he got the true tale of Bilbo after questioning, for which a while strained their friendship. But the wizard seemed to think the truth important. He did not say so to Bilbo, though he thought it important, and disturbing to find that the good hobbit had not told the truth from the first, quite contrary to his habit. The idea of a present was not mere hobbit-like invention all the same. It was suggested to Bilbo, as he confessed, by Gollum's talk that he overheard, for Gollum did in fact call the ring his birthday present many times. That also Gandalf thought strange and suspicious, but he did not discover the truth in this point for many more years, and will be seen in this book. Of Bilbo's later adventures, little more need be said here. With the help of the ring, he escaped from the orc guards at the gate and rejoined his companions. He used the ring many times on his quest, chiefly for the help of his friends, but kept it secret from them. He kept it secret from them as long as he could. After he returned to his home, he never spoke of it again to anyone, save Gandalf and Frodo, and no one else in the Shire knew of his existence, or so he believed. Only to Frodo did he show the account of his journey that he was writing. His sword, Sting, Bilbo hung over the fireplace, and his coat of marvelous mail, the gift of the dwarves from the dragon hoard, he lent to a museum, to the Michael Delving Mathorn house, in fact. But he kept in a drawer at Bag End the old cloak and hood that he had worn on his travels, and the ring, secured by a fine chain, remained in his pocket. He returned to his home at Bag End on June the 22nd in his 52nd year, and nothing very notable occurred in the Shire until Mr. Baggins began the preparations for the celebration of his 111th birthday. At this point, the story begins. Alright, next is going to be a section, Note on the Shire Records. Let me grab another sip of water. Hello, I'm doing good. I hope you enjoy your time here. Just sit back and relax. Okay. At the end of the Third Age, the part played by the hobbits in the great events that led to the inclusion of the Shire in the reunited kingdom awakened among them a more widespread interest in their own history, and many of their traditions, up to the time still mainly oral, were collected and written down. The greater families were also concerned with the events in the kingdom at large, and many of their members studied ancient histories and legends. By the end of the 1st century, the Fourth Age, there was already to be found in the Shire several libraries that contained many historical books and records. The largest of these collections were probably the Undertowers at Great Smiles and at Brandy Hall. This account of the end of the Third Age, drawn mainly from the Red Book of Westmarch, that most important source for history of the War of the Ring, was so called because it was long preserved at the Undertowers, the home of the Fairbarns, Wardens of the West March. It was in origin Bilbo's private diary, which he took with him to Rivendell. Frodo brought it back to the Shire, together with many loose leaves of notes during SR 1420. He nearly filled its pages with his account on the war, but annexed it and preserved it with probably a single red case. There, the 3 large volumes bound in red leather that Bilbo gave to him as a parting gift. To these 4 volumes there added the West March, a 5th contained commentaries, genealogies, and various other matter concerning the Hobbit members of the Fellowship. The original Red Book had not been preserved, but many copies were made, especially of the 1st volume, for the use of descendants of the children of Master Samwise. The most important copy, however, had a different history. It was kept at Great Smiles, and it was written in Gondor, probably at the request of the great-grandson of Peregrine, and completed in 1592. Its southern scribe appended this note: Fingal, King's writer, finished this work in IV 172. In this exact copy, all details of Thane's book in Minas Tirith. That book was a copy made at the request of King Elisar of the Red Book of Pernath, and was brought to him by Thane Peregrine when he retired to Gondor in IV 64. The Thane's book was thus the first copy made of the Red Book, and contained much of that was later omitted or lost. In Minas Tirith, it received much annotation and many corrections, especially of names, words, and quotations in the Elvish languages, and there was added to it abbreviated versions for those parts. I lost my part. Abbreviated versions of those parts of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, which lie outside the account of the war. The full tale stated have to been written by Barhir, grandson of Steward Faramir, some time after the passing of the king, but the chief importance of Fengrill's copy was that it alone contains the whole of Bilbo's translations from the Elvish. The 3 volumes were found to be a work of great skill, and learning in which between 1403 and 1418 he had used all the sources available to him in Rivendell, both living and written. But since they were little used by Frodo, being almost entirely concerned with the elder days, no more is said of them here. Since Meriadoc and Peregrine became the heads of their great families, and at the same time kept up their connections with Rohan and Gondor, the libraries at Bucklebury and Tuckborough contained much of what did not appear in the Red Book. In Brandy Hall, there were many works dealing with Eredor and the history of Rohan. Some of these were composed or begun by Meriadoc himself, though in the Shire he was chiefly remembered for his Herblore of the Shire, and for his reckoning of years, in which he discussed the relations of the calendars of the Shire and Bree to those of Rivendell, Gondor, and Rohan. He also wrote a short treatise on old worlds and names in the Shire, showing a special interest in discovering the kinship with the language of the Rohirrim of such Shire words as Mathom, an old element in place names. At Great Smiles, the book was less interest to the Shire folk, though more important for larger history. None of them was written by Peregrine, but he and his successors collected many manuscripts written by scribes of Gondor, mainly copies or summaries of histories or legends relating to Elendil and his heirs. Only here in the Shire were to be found extensive materials of the history of Numenor and the arising of Sauron. It was probably at Great Smiles that the tale of years was to put together with the assistance of material collected by Meriadoc. Though the dates are given often conjectural, especially for the Second Age, they deserve attention. It is probable that Meriadoc obtained assistance from the information of Rivendell, which he visited more than once. There, though Elrond had departed, his sons long remained, together with some of the High Elven folk. It is said that Celeborn went to dwell there after the departure of Galadriel, but there is no record of the day when he last sought the Grey Havens, and with him the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. Now we begin Book 1. Chapter 1. A long-expected party. Sorry if you can hear my chair crack. Okay. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday party of magical significance, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and he had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become local legend, and it was popularly believed, whether the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure. And if that was not enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as at 50. At 99, they began to call him well preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess apparently perpetual youth, as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth. It will have to be paid for, they said. It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it. But so far trouble had not come, and Mr. Baggins was generous with his money. Most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and good fortune. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, except, of course, the Sackville Bagginses, and he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits of poor and unimportant families, but he had no close friends, until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. The eldest of these was Bilbo's favorite, was young Frodo Baggins. When Bilbo was 99, he adopted Frodo to his heir, and brought him to live with him in Bag End. And the hopes of the Sackville Bagginses was finally dashed. Bilbo and Frodo happened to have the same birthday, September 22nd. You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad, said Bilbo one day, and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together. At the time, Bilbo was still in his tweens, and as hobbits called the irresponsible 20s between childhood and coming of age at 33. 12 more years passed. Each year the Bagginses had given very lively combined birthday parties at Bag End, but now it was understood that something quite exceptional was being planned for that autumn. Bilbo was going to be 11, a rather curious number, and a very respectable age for a hobbit. The old Took himself had only reached 130, and Frodo was going to be 33, an important number, the date of his coming of age. Tongues began to wag in the Hobbiton and Bywater, and the rumor of the coming event traveled all over the Shire. The history and character of Mr. Bilbo Baggins became once again the chief topic of conversation, and the older folk suddenly found their reminiscences in welcome demand. No one had a more attentive audience than old Ham Gee, commonly known as the Gaffer. He held forth at the Ivy Bush, a small inn on the Bywater Road, and he had spoke with some authority, for he had tended to a garden at Bag End for 40 years, and had helped the old Holman in the same job before that. Now that he was himself growing old and stiff in his joints, the job was mainly carried on by his youngest son, Sam Gamgee. Both father and son were on the very friendly terms with Bilbo and Frodo. They had lived on the hill itself in number 3, Backshot Row, just before Bag End. A very nice, well-spoken, gentle hobbit is Mr. Bilbo, and I've always said, the Gaffer declared, with perfect truth, for Bilbo was very polite to him, calling him Master Hamfast, and they consulting him constantly upon the growing vegetables in the matter of roots, especially potatoes. The Gaffer was recognized as the leading authority by all the neighborhood, including himself. But what about this Frodo that lives with him? Asked old Noax of Bywater. Baggins is his name, but he is more than half a brandybuck, they say. It beats me to why any Bagginses of Hobbiton should go looking for a wife, away there in Buckland, where folks are so queer. And no wonder they're queer, put in Daddy Two-Foot, the Gaffer's next-door neighbor, if they live on the wrong side of the Brandywine River, and right again in the old forest. That's a dark, bad place, if half the tales be true. You're right, Dad, said the Gaffer. Not that the Brandywine bucks of Buckland live in the old forest, but they're a queer breed, seemingly. They fool about with boats on the big river, but that isn't natural. Small wonder if that trouble came of it, I say. But be that as it may, Mr. Frodo is a nice young hobbit, as you wish to meet, very much like Mr. Bilbo in more than looks. After all, his father was a Baggins. A decent, respectable hobbit was Mr. Drogo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him until he drowned. Drowned? Said several voices. They had heard this and other darker rumors before, of course, but hobbits have a passion for family history, and they were ready to hear it again. Well, so they say, said the Gaffer. You see, Mr. Drogo, he married poor Miss Primula Brandybuck. She was our Mr. Bilbo's first cousin on the mother's side, her mother being the youngest of the old Took's daughters, and Mr. Drogo was his second cousin. So Mr. Frodo and his first and second cousin once removed either way, as its saying is if you followed me, and Mr. Drogo was staying at Brandy Hall with his father-in-law, old Master Dorabach, as they often did after his marriage, him being partial to his victuals and or Gorbach keeping him a mighty generous table. He went about boating on the Brandywine River. He and his wife were drowned, and poor Mr. Frodo, only a child and all. I've heard they went on the water after dinner in the moonlight, said old Noakes, and it was Drogo's weight that sunk the boat. And I heard she pushed him in, and he pulled her in after him, said Sandyman, the Hobbiton miller. You shouldn't listen to all you hear, Sandyman, said the Gaffer, who did not much like the miller. There is no call to talk of pushing and pulling. Boats are quite tricky enough for those who sit without looking further for the cause of trouble. Anyway, there was this Mr. Frodo, left an orphan and stranded, as you might say, among those queer Bucklanders being brought up anyhow in Brandy Hall, a regular warren by all accounts. Old Master Dorbach have never fewer than a couple hundred relations in the place. Mr. Bilbo never did a kinder deed than when he brought back the lad to live among the Centrefolk. But I reckon it was a nasty shock for those Sackville Bagginses. They thought they were going to get a bag end, and that time when he went off was thought to be dead. And when he comes back and orders them off, and he goes on, living and never looks a day older. Bless him. And suddenly he produces an heir, and all the papers made up proper, and the Sackville Bagginses won't never see the inside of Bag End now, or it is to be hoped not. There is a tidy bit of money tucked up away in there, I hear tell, said a stranger, a visitor on business from Michael Delving in the West Farthing. All the top of your hill is full of tunnels packed with chests of gold and silver and jewels, of what I've heard. Then you've heard more than I can speak to, answered the gaffer. I know nothing about jewels. Mr. Bilbo is free with his money, and there seems no lack of it. But I know of no tunnel making. I saw Mr. Bilbo when he came back, a matter of 60 years ago, when I was a lad. I had not long come prentice to old Holman, him being my dad's cousin, and he had me up at Bag End, helping him to keep the folks from trampling and trespassing all over the garden while the sale was on. In the middle of all, Mr. Bilbo comes up the hill with a pony and some mighty big bags and a couple chests. I don't doubt they were mostly filled with treasure he had picked up in the foreign parts, where there be mountains of gold, they say, but there wasn't enough to fill tunnels. But my lad Sam will know all about that. He's in and out of Bag End. Crazy about stories of the old days he is. He listens to all Mr. Bilbo's tales. Mr. Bilbo had learned his letters, meaning no harm, mark you, and I hope no harm will come of it. Elves and dragons, I say to him, cabbages and potatoes are better for me and you. Don't go getting mixed up in the business of your betters, or you'll land in trouble too big for you. I says to him, and I might say to others, he added, with a look of the stranger and look at the stranger and the miller. But the gaffer did not convince his audience. The legend of Bilbo's wealth was now too firmly fixed in the minds of the younger generation of hobbits. But he likely enough had been adding to what he brought at first, argued the miller, voicing common opinion. He's often away from home, and the look of the outlandish folk that visit him, dwarves coming in at night, and that old wandering conjurer Gandalf and all. You can say what you like, gaffer, but Bag End's a queer place, and its folk are queerer. And you can say what you like about what you know no more than what you do of boating, Mr. Sandyman, retorted the gaffer, disliking the miller even more than usual. If that's being queer, then we do with a bit more queerness in these parts. There's not some far away that wouldn't offer a pint of beer to a friend if they lived in a hole with golden walls, but they do things proper at Bag End. Our Sam says that everyone's going to be invited to the party, and there's going to be presents, mark you, presents for all, this very month, as is. That very month was September, and as fine as you could ask, a day or two later, a rumor, probably started with the knowledgeable Sam, was spread about that there was going to be fireworks. Fireworks, what is more, such had not been seen in the Shire for nigh on a century, not indeed since old Took died. Days passed, and the day drew near. An odd-looking wagon laden with odd-looking packages rolled into Hobbiton one evening and toiled up on a hill to Bag End. The startled hobbits peered out of a lamp-lit doors to gape at it. It was driven out by outlandish folk, singing strange songs, dwarves with long beards and deep hoods. A few of them remained at Bag End, and at the end of the second week in September, a cart came through the bywater of the direction of the Brandywine Bridge, and in broad daylight, an old man was driving it all alone. He wore a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, and a silver scarf. He had long white beard, bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. The small hobbit children ran after the cart through Hobbiton and right up the hill. It had cargo of fireworks, as so rightly guessed. At Bilbo's front door, the old man begins to unload. There were great bundles of fireworks, of all sorts of shapes, each labeled with a large red G in the elf rune. That was Gandalf's mark, of course, and the old man, Gandalf the wizard, whose fame the Shire due mainly to his skills with fires, smokes, and likes. His real business was far more difficult and dangerous, but the Shire folk knew nothing about it. To them, just one of the attractions of the party, hence the excitement of the hobbit children. G for grand, they shouted, and the old man smiled. They knew him by sight, only though he appeared in Hobbiton occasionally and never stopped long, but neither they nor any of the oldest of their elders had seen one of his firework displays. They now belonged to the legendary past. When the old man, helped by Bilbo and some dwarves, had finished unloading, Bilbo gave a few pennies away, but not a single squib or cracker was forthcoming, to the disappointment of the onlookers. "Run away now," said Gandalf. "You'll get plenty when the time comes." Then he disappeared inside with Bilbo, and the door was shut. The young hobbits stared in the door in vain for a while, and then made off. The feeling of the day of the party would never come. Inside Bag End, Bilbo and Gandalf were sitting at the open window of a small room, looking out west onto a garden. The late afternoon was bright and peaceful. The flowers glowed red and golden, snapdragons and sunflowers, and the nasturtiums trailing all over the turf walls and peeping in around the windows. "How bright your garden looks," said Gandalf. "Yes," said Bilbo, "I am very fond of it, and all the dear old Shire. I think I need a holiday." "You mean you go with your plan, then?" "I do. I made my mind up months ago, and I haven't changed it." "Very well. It is no good saying any more. Stick to your plan, your whole plan, mind, and I hope it will turn out for the best for you, and for all of us." "I hope so. Anyway, I mean to enjoy myself on Thursday and have my little joke." "And who will laugh, I wonder?" said Gandalf, shaking his head. "We shall see," said Bilbo. The next day, more carts rolled up on the hill, and still more carts. There might have been some grumbling about dealing locally, but that was very weak. Orders began to pour out of Bag End for every kind of provision, commodity, or luxury that could be obtained in Hobbiton or Bywater or anywhere near the neighborhood. People became enthusiastic, and they began to tick off the days on the calendar, and they watched eagerly for the postman, hoping for invitations. Long before the invitations began pouring out, and the Hobbiton post office was blocked, and the Bywater post office was snowed under, and the voluntary assistant postmen were called for. There was a constant stream of them going up the hill, carrying hundreds of polite variations on "Thank you, I shall certainly come." A notice appeared on the gate of Bag End: no admittance except on party business. And even those who had, or pretended to have party business, were seldom allowed inside. Bilbo was busy, writing invitations, taking off answers, packing up presents, and making some private preparations of his own. From the time of Gandalf's arrival, he remained hidden from view. One morning, the hobbits woke to find a large field south of Bilbo's front door, covered with ropes and poles for tents and pavilions. A special entrance was cut into the blank, leading to the road, and wide steps and a large white gate were built there. The 3 hobbit families of Bagshot Row, adjoining the field, were intensely interested and generally envied. The old gaffer Gamgee stopped even pretending to work in his garden. The tents began to go up, and there was a specially large pavilion, so big that the tree that grew in the field was right inside it, and stood proudly near one end, and at the head of the chief table. Lanterns were hung on all of its branches, more promising still to the hobbit's mind. To the hobbit's mind, an enormous open-air kitchen was erected in the north corner of the fields. A draught of cooks from every inn and eating house for miles around arrived to supplement the dwarves and the other odd folk that were quartered at Bag End. Excitement rose to its height. Then the weather clouded over. That was on Wednesday, the eve of the party. Anxiety was intense. Then Thursday, September the 22nd, actually dawned. The sun got up, the clouds vanished, flags were unfurled, and the fun began. Bilbo Baggins called it a party, but it was really a variety of entertainments rolled into one. Practically everybody living near was invited. Very few were overlooked by accident, but as they turned up all the same, that did not matter. Many people from other parts of the Shire were also asked, and that there were even a few on the outside borders. Bilbo met the guests in addition to the new White Gate in person. He gave away presents to all and sundry. The latter were those who went out again by back way and came in again by the gate. Hobbits give presents to other people on their own birthdays. Not very expensive ones, as a rule, and not so lavishly on this occasion, but it was not a bad system. Actually, in Hobbiton and Bywater, every day in the year it's somebody's birthday, so that every hobbit in those parts had a fair chance of at least one present at least once a week. But they never got tired of them. On this occasion, the presents were unusually good. The hobbit children were so excited for a while they almost forgot about eating. There were toys, the like of which they had never seen before, all beautiful and some obviously magical. Many of them had indeed been ordered a year before, and had come all the way from the mountain and from Dale. And were real dwarf make. When every guest had been welcomed and was finally inside the gate, there were songs, dances, music, games, and of course food and drink. There were 3 official meals: lunch, tea, and dinner or supper. But the lunch and tea were marked chiefly by the fact that at those times all the guests were sitting down and eating together. At other times there were merely lots of people eating and drinking continuously from 11s until 6:30 when the fireworks started. The fireworks were by Gandalf. They were not only brought by him, but designed and made by him, and the special effects, set pieces, and flights of rockets were let off by him. But there was also a generous distribution of squibs, crackers, bacca-wrappers, sparklers, torches, dwarf candles, elf fountains, goblin barkers, and thunderclaps. They were all superb. The art of Gandalf improved with age. There were rockets like a flight of scintillating birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke. Their leaves opened like a whole spring unfolding in a moment, and their shining branches dropped glowing flowers down on the astonished hobbits, disappearing with a sweet scent just before they touched their upturned faces. There were fountains of butterflies that flew glittering into trees. There were pillars of colored fires that rose and turned to eagles, or sailing ships, or phalanx of flying swans. There was a red thunderstorm, a shower of yellow rain. There was a forest of silver spears that sprang suddenly into the air with a yell like an embattled army, and came down again into the water with a hiss like 100 hot snakes. And there was also one last surprise, in honor of Bilbo, and it startled the hobbits exceedingly, as Gandalf intended. The lights went out. A great smoke went up. It was shaped itself like a mountain seen in the distance, and began to glow at the summit. It spouted green and scarlet flames. Out flew a red, golden dragon, not life-size, but terribly lifelike. Fire came from his jaws, his eyes glared down. There was a roar, and he whizzed 3 times over the heads of the crowd. They all ducked, and many fell flat on their faces. The dragon passed by an express train, turned a somersault, and burst over Bywater with a deafening explosion. "That is the signal for supper," said Bilbo. The pain and alarm vanished at once, and the prostrate of hobbits leaped to their feet. There was a splendid supper for everyone, that is, except those invited to the special family dinner party. This was held in the great pavilion with the tree. The invitations were limited to 12 dozen, a number so called by the hobbits, one gross, though the word was not considered proper to use of people. And the guests were selected from all families to which Bilbo and Frodo were related, with addition of a few special unrelated friends, such as Gandalf. Many young hobbits were included and present by parental permission, for hobbits were easygoing with their children in the matter of sitting up late, especially when there was a chance of getting them a free meal. Bringing up young hobbits took a lot of provender. There were many Bagginses and Boffins, and many Tooks and Brandybucks. There were various Grubbs, relations of Bilbo Baggins' grandmother, and various Chubbs, connects of his Took grandfather, and the selection of Burrowesses, Bulgars, Brace Girls, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, and Proudfoots. Some of them were only very distinctly connected with Bilbo, and some of them had hardly ever been in Hobbiton before, as they loved in the remote corners of the Shire. The Sackville Bagginses were not forgotten. Ortho and his wife Labella were present. They disliked Bilbo and detested Frodo, but so magnificent was the invocation card written in gold ink, they had felt it was impossible to refuse. Besides, their cousin Bilbo had been specialized in food for many years, and his table had a high reputation. Okay. All the 144 guests expected a pleasant feast, though they rather dreaded the after-dinner speech of their host, an inevitable item. He was liable to drag in bits of what he called poetry, and sometimes, after a glass or two, would allude to the absurd adventures of his mysterious journey. The guests were not disappointed. They had a very pleasant feast, and in fact an engrossing entertainment, rich, abundant, varied, and prolonged. The purchase of provisions felt almost to nothing throughout the district of the ensuing weeks, but Bilbo Catering had depleted the stocks of most stores, cellars, and warehouses for miles around. That did not matter much. After the feast, more or less, came the speech. Most of the company were, however, now in tolerant mood, and that the delightful stage for which calling the filling up the corners. They were slipping their favorite drinks and nibbling their favorite dainties, and their fears were forgotten. They were prepared to listen to anything, to cheer at the very full stop. "My dear people," began Bilbo, rising to his place. "Hear, hear, hear," they shouted, and kept on repeating it in chorus, seeming reluctant to follow their own advice. Bilbo left his place and went and stood on a chair under an illuminated tree. The light of the lanterns fell on his beaming face. The gold buttons shone on his... Excuse me. I'm yawning so much. I apologize. The light of his lanterns fell on his face. The gold buttons shone on his embroidered silk waistcoat. They could all see him standing, waving one hand in the air. The other was in his trousers pocket. "My dear Bagginses and Boffins," he began again, "and my dear Tooks and Brandybucks and Grubbs and Chubbs and Burrows and Hornblowers and Boglars, Brace Girdlers, Goodbodies, Brockhouses, and Proudfoots." "Proud feet," shouted an elderly hobbit from the back of the pavilion. His name, of course, was Proudfoot, and well merited. His feet were large, exceptionally furry, and both were on the table. "Proudfoots," repeated Bilbo, "and also my good Sackville Bagginses, that I welcome back at last to Bag End. Today is my 111th birthday. I am 11y today. Hooray, hooray, many happy returns," they shouted, as they hammered joyously on the tables. Bilbo was doing splendidly. This was the sort of stuff they liked. Short and obvious. I hope you are all enjoying yourself as much as I am. Deafening cheers, cries of yes and no, noises of trumpets, horns, pipes, and flutes, and other musical instruments. There were, as had been said, many young hobbits present. Hundreds of musical crackers had been pulled. Most of them bore marked Dale on them, which did not convey much to most of the hobbits, but they all agreed they were marvelous crackers. They contained instruments, small but of perfect make and enchanting tones. Indeed, in one corner some took the young tooks and brandy-bucks, supposing Uncle Bilbo had finished, since he had plainly said all that was necessary, now got up an impromptu orchestra and began a merry dance tune. Master Everard took and Miss Melliot Brandybuck got on the table with bells in their hands and began to dance to the springle ring, a pretty dance, but rather vigorous. But Bilbo had not finished. Seizing the horn from a youngster nearby, he blew 3 loud hoots. The noise subsided. "I shall not keep you long," he cried. Cheers from the assembly. "I have called you all together for a purpose." Something in the way that had said made an impression. There was almost silence, and 1 or 2 of the tooks pricked up their ears. "Indeed, for 3 purposes. First of all, to tell you that I am immensely fond of you all, and that 11 years is too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits." Tremendous outbursts of approval. "I don't know half of you half as well as I would like, and I like less than half of you, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve." Sorry, that was a very hard line. This was unexpected and rather difficult. There was some scattered clapping, and most of them were trying to work it out and see if it came to a compliment. Secondly, to celebrate my birthday, cheers again, I should say our birthday, for it is, of course, also the birthday of my heir and nephew Frodo. He comes of age and into his inheritance today. Some perfunctory clapping by the elders, and some shouts of "Frodo! Frodo! Jolly old Frodo!" from the juniors. The Sackville Bagginses scowled in wonder what was meant by the coming into his inheritance. Together we score 144. Your numbers were chosen to fit this remarkable total. 1 gross, if I may use the expression. No cheers. This was ridiculous. Many of his guests, and especially the Sackville Bagginses, were insulted, feeling sure they had only been asked to fill their required number, like goods in a package. 1 gross indeed. Vulgar expression. It is also, if I may allowed to refer to ancient history, the anniversary of my arrival by barrel at Esgroth, the Long Lake, though the fact that it was my birthday slipped from memory on that occasion. I was only 51 then, and birthdays did not seem so important. The banquet was very splendid, however, though I had a bad cold at the time. I remember I could only say, "Thank you very much." Now I repeat it more correctly. "Thank you very much for coming to my little party." Obstinate silence. They all feared that a song or some poetry was now imminent, and they were all getting bored. Why couldn't he stop talking and let them drink his health? But Bilbo did not sing or recite. He paused for a moment. "Thirdly, and finally," he said, "I wish to make an announcement." He spoke the last words so loudly and suddenly that everyone sat up who still could. I regret to announce that, though, as I said, 11 years is far too short a time to spend among you, this is the end. I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye. He stepped down and vanished. There was a blinding flash of light, and the guests all blinked. When they opened their eyes, Bilbo was nowhere to be seen. 144 flabbergasted hobbits sat back speechless. Old Otto Proudfoot removed his feet from the table and stamped. There was a dead silence, and suddenly several deep breaths. Every Baggins, Boffin, Took, Bandybuck, Grubb, Chubb, Burrows, Bulger, Bracegirdle, Brockhouse, Goodbordy, Hornblower, and Proudfoot began to talk at once. It was generally agreed that the joke, in very bad taste, and more food and drink were needed to cure the guests of shock and annoyance. "He's mad, I always said so," was probably the most popular comment. Even the Tooks, with few exceptions, thought Bilbo's behavior was absurd. For the moment, most of them took it for granted that his disappearance was nothing more than a ridiculous prank. But old Rory Brandybuck was not so sure. Neither age nor an enormous dinner had clouded his wits, and he said to his daughter-in-law, Esmeralda, "There's something fishy about this, my dear. I believe that Mad Baggins is off again. Silly old fool. But why worry? He hasn't taken the victuals with him." He called loudly to Frodo and send the wine round again. Frodo was the only one present who had said nothing. For some time he had sat back silent beside Bilbo's empty chair and ignored all the remarks and questions. He had enjoyed the joke, of course, even though it had been in the know. He had difficulty in keeping from laughter at the indignant surprise of the guests, but at the same time he felt deeply troubled. He realized suddenly that he loved the old hobbit dearly. Most of the guests went on eating and drinking and discussing Bilbo Baggins' oddities, past and present, but the Sackville Bagginses had already departed in wrath. Frodo did not want to have any more to do with the party. He gave orders for more wine to be served, then he got up and drained his own glass silently to the health of Bilbo, and slipped out of the pavilion. As for Bilbo Baggins, even while he was making his speech, he had been fingering the gold ring in his pocket, the magic ring that he had kept a secret for so many years. As he stepped down, he slipped it on his finger, and he was never seen by any hobbit in Hobbiton again. He walked briskly back to his hole for a moment, listening with a smile to the din of the pavilion, to the sounds of merrymaking in other parts of the field. Then he went in. He took off his party clothes, folded up and wrapped in tissue paper of his embroidered silk waistcoat, and put it away. He put on quickly some old untidy garments and fastened around his waist a worn leather belt. On it he hung a short sword in battered black leather scabbard. From a locked drawer, smelling of mothballs, he took out an old cloak and hood. They had been locked up as if they were very precious, but they were patched and weather-stained that their original color could hardly be guessed. It might have been dark green. They were rather too large for him. Then he went to his study, and from a large, strong box took out a bundle wrapped in cloths and a leather-bound manuscript, and also a large, bulky envelope. The book and the bundle he stuffed into the top of the heavy bag was standing there, already nearly full. The envelope he slipped his golden ring and its fine chain and sealed it, and addressed it to Frodo. At first, he put it on the mantelpiece, but suddenly he removed it and stuck it in his pocket. At that moment, the door opened, and Gandalf quickly came in. "Hello," said Bilbo. "I wondered if you would turn up." "I'm glad to find you visible," replied the wizard, sitting down in the chair. "I wanted to catch you and have a few final words. I suppose you feel that everything has gone off splendidly and according to plan." "Yes, I do," said Bilbo, "though that flash was surprising. It quite startled me, let alone the others. A little addition of your own, I suppose." "It was. You have quite wisely kept that ring secret all these years. It seemed to me necessary to give your guests something else that would seem to explain your sudden vanishment." "It would spoil my joke. You are interfering, old busybody," laughed Bilbo. "But I expect you know best as usual." "I do, when I know anything, but I don't feel too sure about this whole affair. It has now come to the final point. You've had your joke and alarmed or offended most of your relations, and had given the whole Shire something to talk about for 9 days, or 99 more likely. Are you going any further?" "Yes, I am. I feel I need a holiday, a very long holiday, as I've told you before. Probably a permanent holiday. I don't expect I shall return. In fact, I don't mean to. And I have made all the arrangements." "I am old, Gandalf. I don't look it, but I am beginning to feel it in my heart of hearts. Well preserved indeed," he sorted. "Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like the butter that's been scraped off the bread too much. That can't be right. I need a change or something. Gandalf looked curiously and closely at him. No, it does not seem right, he said thoughtfully. No, after all, I believe your plan is probably the best. Well, I've made up my mind anyway. I want to see mountains again, Gandalf. Mountains. And then find somewhere where I can rest. In peace and quiet, without a lot of relatives prying around and a string of confounded visitors hanging on the bell. I might find somewhere where I can finish my book. I'll have the thought of a nice ending for it. And he lived happily ever after to the end of his days. Gandalf laughed. I hope he will, but nobody will read the book however it ends. Oh, they may in years to come. Frodo has read some already, as far as it has gone. You'll keep an eye on Frodo, won't you? Yes, I will. 2 eyes, as often as I can spare them. He would come with me, of course, if I asked him. In fact, he offered to once, just before the party, but he does not really want to yet. I want to see the wild country again before I die, and the mountains, but he is still in love with the Shire, with the woods and the fields and the little rivers. He ought to be comfortable here. I am leaving everything with him, of course, except a few oddments. I hope he will be happy. When he gets used to being on his own. It's time he was his own master now. Everything, said Gandalf. The ring as well? You agreed to that, you remember? Well, yes, I suppose, stammered Bilbo. Where is it? In an envelope, if you must know, said Bilbo impatiently. There on the mantelpiece. Well, no. Here it is in my pocket. He hesitated. Isn't that odd now? He said softly to himself. Yet after all, why not? Why shouldn't it stay there? Gandalf looked again very hard at Bilbo, and there was a gleam in his eyes. I think, Bilbo, he said quietly, I should leave it behind. Don't you want to? Well, yes, and no. Now it comes to it, I don't like parting with it at all, I may say. I don't really see why I should. Why do you want me to? He asked, and a curious change came over his voice, with a sharp suspicion and annoyance. You are always badgering me about my ring, but you have never bothered me about any other things that I got on my journey. No, but I had to badger you, said Gandalf. I wanted the truth. It was important. Magical rings are, well, magical, and they are rare and curious. I was professionally interested in your ring, you may say, and still am. I should like to know where it is if you go wandering again, and I also think you had it quite long enough. You won't need it any more, Bilbo, unless I am quite mistaken. Bilbo flushed. There was an angry light in his eyes. His kindly face grew hard. Why not? He cried. And what business is it of yours anyway to know what I do with my own things? It is my own. I found it. It came to me. Yes, said Gandalf, but there's no need to get angry. If I am, it is your fault, said Bilbo. It is mine, I tell you, my own. My precious. Yes, my precious. The wizard's face remained grave and attentive, and only a flicker in his deep eyes showed that he was startled and indeed alarmed. It had been called that before, he said, but not by you. But I say it now, and why not? Even if Gollum said the same once, it's not now his, but mine, and I shall keep it, I say. Bilbo stood up. Gandalf stood up and spoke sternly. You will be a fool if you do, Bilbo, he said. You make that clear with every word you say. It has gotten too far hold on you. Let it go, and that you can go yourself and be free. I'll do as I choose, and I go as I please, said Bilbo obstinately. Now, my dear hobbit, said Gandalf. All your long life we have been friends. You owe me something. Come, do as you promised. Give it up. Gandalf, give it up. Well, if you want my ring yourself, say so. But you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you. His hand straight to the hilt of his small sword. Gandalf's eyes flashed. It will be my turn to get angry soon, he said. If you say that again, I shall. Then you will see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked. He took a step toward the hobbit, and he seemed to grow tall and menacing. His shadow filled the little room. Bilbo backed away into the hall, breathing hard, his hand clutching at his pocket. They stood for a while facing each other, and the air of the room tingled. Gandalf's eyes remained bent on the hobbit. Slowly, his hands relaxed and began to tremble. I don't know what has come over you, Gandalf, he said. You've never been like this before. What is it all about? It is mine, isn't it? I found it, and Gollum would have killed me if I hadn't kept it. I'm not a thief, whatever he said. I have never called you one, Gandalf answered. I am not one either. I'm not trying to rob you, but to help you. I wish you would trust me as you used. He turned away, and the shadow passed. He seemed to dwindle again as an old gray man, bent and troubled. Bilbo drew his hands over his eyes. I am sorry, he said, but I feel so queer, and yet it would be a relief in a way not to be bothered with it anymore. It had been growing on my mind lately. Sometimes I have felt it was like an eye looking at me, and I am always wanting to put it on and disappear. Don't you know? Or wondering if it is safe and pulling it out to make sure. I tried locking it up, but I found I couldn't resist without it in my pocket. I don't know why, and I don't seem able to make up my mind. Then trust mine, said Gandalf, and it is quite made up. Go away and leave it behind. Stop possessing it. Give it to Frodo, and I will look after him. Bilbo stood for a moment, tense and undecided. Presently he sighed. All right, he said with an effort. I will. Then he shrugged his shoulders and smiled rather ruefully. After all, that's what this party business was all about, really. To give away lots of birthday presents and somehow make it easier to give it away at the same time. It hasn't made it any easier in the end, but it would be a pity to waste all my preparations. It would quite spoil the joke. Indeed, it would take away only the point I ever saw in the affair. In the affair, said Gandalf. Very well, said Bilbo. It goes to Frodo, and with all the rest, he drew a deep breath. And now I really must be starting, or somebody will catch me. I have said goodbye. I couldn't bear to do it all over again. He picked up his bag and moved to the door. You still have the ring in your pocket, said the wizard. Well, so I have, cried Bilbo, and my will and all the other documents too. You had better take it and deliver it for me. That will be the safest. No, don't give the ring to me, said Gandalf. Put it on the mantelpiece. It will be safe enough there, till Frodo comes. I shall wait for him. Bilbo took out the envelope, and just as he was about to set it on the clock, his hand jerked back, and the packet fell on the floor. Before he could pick it back up, the wizard stooped and seized it and set it in its place. A spasm of anger passed swiftly over the hobbit's face again. Suddenly, it gave way to a look of relief and a laugh. Well, that's that, he said. Now I'm off. They went out into the hall. Bilbo chose his favorite stick from the stand. Then he whistled. 3 dwarves came out in different rooms where they had been busy. Is everything ready? Asked Bilbo. Is everything packed and labeled? Everything, he answered. Well, let's start then. He stepped down on the front door. It was a fine night, and the black sky was dotted with stars. He looked up, sniffing the air. What fun. What fun to be off again. Off on the road with dwarves. This was what I had been really longing for years. Goodbye, he said, looking at his old home and bowing to the door. Goodbye, Gandalf. Goodbye, for the present, Bilbo. Take care of yourself. You are old enough, perhaps wise enough. Take care. I don't care. Don't you worry about me. I am as happy now as I've ever been, and that is saying a great deal. But the time has come. I am being swept off my feet at last," he added, and then in a low voice, as if to himself, he sang softly in the dark. "The road goes on, ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road is gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then, I cannot say." He paused for a moment, and with another word he turned away from the lights and voices in the fields and tents, and followed by his 3 companions went round into his garden and trotted down the long sloping path. He jumped over a low place in the hedge at the bottom and took to the meadows, passing into the night like a rustle of wind in the grass. Gandalf remained for a while, staring after him in the darkness. "Goodbye, my dear Bilbo, until our next meeting," he said softly, and went back indoors. Frodo came in soon afterwards, and found him sitting in the dark, deep in thought. "Has he gone?" he asked. "Yes," answered Gandalf. He has gone at last. I hoped until this evening that it was only a joke," said Frodo, "but I knew in my heart he really meant to go. He always used to joke about serious things. I wish I had come back sooner just to see him off." "I really think he preferred slipping off quietly in the end," said Gandalf. "Don't be too troubled. He will be all right now. He left a packet for you. There it is." Frodo took the envelope from the mantelpiece and glanced at it, but did not open it. "You'll find his will and all the other documents in there, and I think," he said the wizard, "you are the master of Bag End now. And also, I fancy, you'll find a golden ring." "A ring!" exclaimed Frodo. "Has he left me that? I wonder why. Still, it may be useful." It may not," said Gandalf. "I should not make use of it if I were you, but keep it secret, keep it safe. Now, I am going to bed." As the master of Bag End, Frodo felt it painful duty to say goodbye to the guests. Rumors of strange events had now by spread all over the field, but Frodo would only say, "No doubt everything will be cleared up in the morning." About midnight, carriages came for the important folk. One by one they strolled away, filled with full but very unsatisfied hobbits. Gardeners came by, arraignment, and removed in wheelbarrows, and those had inadvertently remained behind. Night slowly passed. The sun rose. The hobbits rose rather later. Morning went on. People came and began, by orders, to clear the way the pavilion and the tables, and the chairs, and the spoons, and knives, and bottles, and plates, and the lanterns, and the flowers, shrubs, and boxes, and the crumbs and cracker paper, the forgotten bags and gloves and handkerchiefs, and the uneaten food, a very small item. Then a number of other people came, without orders, Bagginses, and Boffins, and Bulgars, and Tooks, and the other guests that lived or were staying near. By midday, even the best fed were out and about again. There was a large crowd at Bag End, uninvited, but not unexpected. Frodo was waiting on the step, smiling but looking rather tired and worried. He welcomed all the callers, but he had not much more to say than before. His reply to all inquiries was simply this: "Mr. Bilbo Baggins has gone away. As far as I know, for good. Some visitors he invited to come inside, as Bilbo had left messages for them." Inside the hall there were piled a large assortment of packages and parcels and small articles of furniture. On every item there was a label tied. There were several labels of the sort. But Alargard took for his very own from Bilbo on an umbrella. Allard had carried off many unlabeled ones. For Dora Baggins, in memory of a long correspondence with love from Bilbo, on a large waste paper basket. Dora was Drago's sister and the eldest surviving female relative of Bilbo and Frodo. She was 99 and had written reams of good advice for more than a century. For Milo burrows, hoping it'll be useful. From BB, on a gold pin and an ink bottle. Milo never answered letters. For Angelica's use, from Uncle Bilbo, on a round convex mirror. She was young Baggins, and too obviously considered her face shapely. For the collection of Hugo Braceburgle, a contributor on an empty bookcase. Hugo was a great borrower of books, and worse than usual at returning them. And Lobella Sackville Baggins, as a present, on a case of silver spoons. Bilbo believed that she had acquired a good many of his spoons while he was away on his former journey. Lobella knew that quite well. When she arrived later in the day, she took the point at once. She also took the spoons. Okay. I think we're gonna end it off there. We've kind of reached a break in the paragraph. We're 40 pages in, but we have read quite a bit of it. Of course, that is nothing compared to the 400 pages that this book has, so we will be reading it for quite a while. But I hope you all are feeling at ease. I hope you all maybe have listened and fallen asleep. I think that good dreams will come around for you. I will leave off peacefully to not wake you. But of course, I will be back once again tomorrow. Please take care of yourselves. Please make sure that you drink some water, that you eat some food, and if you aren't already sleeping, if it's past your bedtime, you know what you should do. It's wonderful to see you, Thick. I'm glad you found it relaxing. It's very, very good to hear. So for everyone who is not asleep, good night, and I will see you all tomorrow.